Everyone for attending our second Lincolnshire Grand Rounds. Our guest today is Professor Fenton. He is a Professor of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck, Limerick University Hospital, Consultant ENT in Limerick University Hospitals. He's been everywhere almost. He works in Australia, trained in Australia, Ireland, UK, and now he's based in Ireland in a nice city called Limerick. Is it southwest, Professor? Yeah, or south? I've been honored as well to work with him. He was my generous mentor, so I got a lot of things from him. So thank you for accepting my invitation. Our topic today was being discussed before. What is the best for the trainees, and what's the most interest bit of research is, and we agreed that how to write a proper paper is the acceptable or the best topic to talk about. So, Professor, we can start.
Thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you to Adele Salim for volunteering me. We shouldn't forget the French. I know we've had Brexit, but I did train in France also. I've written a few papers in my time, and I've presented the best part of this present at Brussels in 2017 or 2019 as part of the CEORL HNS Confederation meeting. And I'll take this opportunity to invite you all to Dublin in June of next year for the next Confederation. We had Milan last October, November. And hopefully some of you or all of you can join. If there are, this talk is primarily dedicated to trainees, and I hope I can impart some of my experience. But there is the Confederation is a wonderful meeting, and there is a special basic track which is dedicated to trainees. So I'd welcome you all to Dublin in June of next year, if you can make the journey across the water. I'd like to start with my first slide. So, Ibrahim, if you can put it up there for me, please.
Yes, sure.
And I'll move on to the next one. So I've called this the P's and Q's. Next slide, please. My challenge is to keep you awake, for you to have 3 take-home messages, and hopefully these will be imprinted indelibly on your higher cortex. The next slide is the P's of scientific publication. It's really the only busy slide of the entire talk. It is the only P's, but you can see that there are a number of ways of looking at a paper, and you've got to say to yourself, well, okay, you won't know how to write a paper until you've read a few papers. And the only way to write better is to write often and get used to writing. So you plan, you peruse, you do use proper English, proper length, proper structure. It should be pithy, precise, pertinent. You must persevere, and you must have patience. You practice to become perfect. And in the end, some of you might even take some pleasure in writing, but there's great pleasure in finally getting your paper published. If I move on to the next slide, one of the best authors I've ever worked with was Professor Andrew Jones in Liverpool. I was the senior lecturer and a consultant in Liverpool back in the late 90s, early noughties. He was the professor, and I think I have to mention him because I don't think I've ever met anyone who published as much and as well as he did. And this brings us into the first elephant in the room of AI. When I was a kid growing up, AI was what the farmers did, which was artificial insemination. Now it's more artificial intelligence. He came to me 25 years ago and he said, John, there's this wonderful artificial intelligence going around. I think we should do a paper on, can we predict laryngeal squamous carcinoma? And we published this paper 20 years ago nearly, long before AI became the popular concept it is now. And I have to acknowledge him in that he was a man ahead of his time, well ahead of his time in head and neck surgery, in flap reconstruction, and in writing both papers and books. The reason I'm bringing it up is that there is a possibility out there right now that AI can do the paper for us. So why write a paper when you can just put it into AI and right away? I'm just back from Bulgaria at the ERS meeting, where the chair said that he looks forward to AI writing the papers because he's a reviewer for a journal and he's hoping that the papers will be better written. I asked about the ethics of AI and the ethics of getting artificial intelligence to write the paper for you, and let's just say there wasn't much of an answer. We will be addressing this, and Professor Ray Clark has agreed to give a talk in Dublin on one of our roundtables on AI and GPT as a method of authorship. Some of you may know already that in the States, especially, there are special units in each department and each hospital, I think, to write papers. So basically, give them your results from your study, and they'll write the papers for you. I'm not sure that's ethically correct, but if it's accepted by the editors, it is. Furthermore, making agreements with other members in other hospitals to write papers, that's probably fine as well, as long as you stick to the rules of authorship. So I'll move on to the next slide. I call this my Magnificent Seven. These are the 7 questions, and there are 7 questions that relate to looking at a blank page and wondering where you're going to start. So the first thing is the introduction. And introduction can be broken down into 3. And you can fill around it, but basically, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about it? And what are your objectives? How are you going to talk about it? So therefore, any paper, and this includes presentation. So you're presenting a paper, you're writing a paper, you're discussing a paper, you've got an idea of a paper. What are you talking about? Why are you talking about it? What's the reason? What makes it interesting? What's the clinical peril that you're going to, what are you looking for? What answers need to be addressed? So then materials and methods are, how did you do it? If we move on to the next slide with results, it's quite simple, really. It's what did you find? What were your results? Go back again, back one. So we'll go back one slide to my other questions. There we are. So I've purposefully skipped the discussion because I want to give some specific slides for that later. But the conclusions are, what do your results imply? Not what results anywhere else imply, but what do your results? And the conclusions should be related to your aims. So the conclusion of your paper must be related to the aims in the introduction. And there are 7 basic questions that any presentation or paper should include. Next slide, please. Most problems arise with authorship. And I just wanted to give you a definition of gift and ghost authorship. Gift, guest, or honorary authorship is where you're including authors, very often senior colleagues, who at best had a peripheral role in the article. And therefore you're wondering, do they really deserve to be authors? The fear, of course, is if you don't include them, that it may impact on your career and your writing in the first instance to progress your career. But there is a term, gift authorship, and gift authorship should not really happen. Ghost authorship, first of all, I've mentioned ghost writing already, which is the unit that might be there to write the papers for you. But ghost authorship itself is where you fail to name an author. And again, I'm on the PubMed slide, our picture there, I'm showing you that both myself and Andrew Jones have written a paper on integrity in medical research and publication, published back in Clinoto in 2002, where a lot of the definitions and a lot of the guidance on integrity is provided. But again, most rows in papers are over authorship, where people who believe they should have been an author should have been included. And if that happens, it's called ghost authorship, where they were excluded unfairly. Next slide, please. We also published a paper from our unit here in Limerick on the reporting of Research Ethics Committee approval and informed consent in otolaryngology journals. And the overall rate was pretty poor, it was only 51.1%. What you must remember is that all studies that report on human participants or human tissue should seek Research Ethics Committee approval. And also, if you're storing any information on your home computer, if you're keeping any data on any patient in any study, now, even if it is retrospective and even if it is anonymized, you should seek the chair approval, which is not full ethical approval, but you should seek chair approval because it ensures that we uphold ethical standards for data collection. And it's to protect you, not just the patient, but to protect you from any untoward outcome. And this is, I'm mentioning authorship and I'm mentioning ethics from the start as part of how to write a paper. So get the authors right, make sure you agree on the authors, and make sure you have ethics. A lot of journals now will not accept your papers unless you've got ethical approval, whether it be full study approval or chair or approval by the chair that you're within the ethical standards. Next slide, please. We looked at, as an example, we looked at postal surveys, and we called it CPQ, which is Consultant Postal Questionnaires. Did 2 studies, in fact. Our follow-up study was published by my colleague now, Stephen Ryan, here in Limerick, and we found that many surveys did not include research ethics. In fact, 88% of them didn't approval. You do need approval for postal survey. And therefore, key recurring deficiencies in methodology is the absence of ethical approval. They fail to obtain it, and you should and you must. It again helps you. A lot of targets now that you write to looking for answers to survey, you send them out, whether it be email or written, mostly email now, won't answer your survey unless you've got ethical approval, and it's the right thing to do. No ethical approval, survey shouldn't be answered. So survey should not be sent out until there is ethical approval. Next slide, please. Right, so which journal? Well, you have your topic, you've done your study, you've presented it, now you got to publish it. And you got to say to yourself, well, which journal suits my work? Is it an ENT journal? And if it is an ENT journal, which one is best suited? So you read the back issues, look at the style, look at the content. Most of them publish the aims of the journal, and all have instructions of authors or for authors. Again, choosing the journal is very important because at the end of the day, you're writing the paper to get it published. And if you don't send the paper into a journal that isn't suited, that's going to be rejected. Next slide, please. How do you impress the editor? Well, remember the acceptance rate is 25 to 50% generally, and some journals are often worse. Some journals don't. I mean, a typical answer from the laryngoscope is that your paper is very good, but we have a lot of other papers that are better, and we don't have the space or the room to accept your paper. So is the study sound and original? Is it interesting? Is it controversial? And does it fit the hierarchy of the journal? So again, it is disappointing to put work into a paper and have it rejected. But the first thing you do is make sure you're sending it to the correct journal. Next slide, please. A way to look on this then is what does the editor ask the reviewer? So when you send in a paper, the paper is going to be reviewed by 1, 2, or even 3 colleagues. And the editor is asking, and they're not just critical, they're there to help you. So is this paper suitable for this journal? Is it scientifically sound? Are the conclusions justified? And justified basically on what you found and related to your aims. Can the paper be shortened? Are all the tables and figures justified? So you've got to make sure all of these are correct before you submit. It saves time just to take a little bit extra to check Are you correct? Next slide, please. So most journals will send this form to the reviewer and they'll say, is this paper acceptable as it stands? Very, very few get that pass on first go. Is it acceptable subject to minor changes? Is it acceptable subject to major changes? So you're usually somewhere between the second and the third there. Is it rejected? And remember that their success is dependent on the quality of the papers they publish. So they have to publish quality. Their reputation is based on the quality of their publication. It's like a football match. You're as good as your next match. Next slide, please. What are the rules? Again, I've told you instructions for authors, very often on the Vancouver outlay. Most papers should be less than 2,000 words, 8 to 10 double-spaced pages, tables and figures kept to a minimum. Now, one important thing on the tables and figures is that if you put in tables and figures, you don't need to repeat those results in the results. They're standalone, so they should not be repeated in the results. So keep them separate. You can reference to the table or to the figure, and it saves you a lot of time to have a table or a figure based on what you're trying to present, and sometimes easier to read for the reader as well. Next slide, please. The style. Some of us may, or some of you may not be, the English may not be the first language, but if it's not worth writing well, it's not worth writing. Be careful. To an English language journal, use simple, direct English. Nouns and verbs. Forget your adjectives and forget your adverbs. It should be accurate, brief, and to the point. Next slide, please. If you're using abbreviations, you should use the full term at the first mention and then continue with abbreviations. Get a rhythm. Have a rhythm to your paper. Make it easy to read. The reader wants to learn and wants to learn easily, but avoid staccato. Just have a nice pace and have a logical progression. Read it and reread it and put it, something you write the night before and then you read it the following morning and say, oh my God, did I really write that? Because it does show up that you mightn't have been informed the night before, but you can spot, no, that's not good. That doesn't read well on the following day. Just be patient. If you take your time before you submit, you're more likely to get it accepted rather than changing at a later stage. Next slide, please. Again, brief and clear, easy to read, hard. Easy to read is hard to write. You have to work at it. Don't be pompous. I mean, I know that the collective term for a group of professors is a pomposity. So that's some maybe a bit of useless information that some of you didn't know. But avoid pomposity. Try not to be wordy. It just obscures your message. You're trying to give a message. One of my favorite sayings is, please excuse this long letter, but I did not have time to write a short one. To write a short one, it takes a lot longer and a lot more time to write a long one. Next slide, please. That saying was often attributed to Mark Twain or Benjamin Franklin, but originally it actually came from Blaise Pascal in Lettres Provençales in the 1600s. And his comment was, I would have written a shorter letter, but I did not have the time. I'm re-emphasizing this because I think it's important. If you can shorten it and if you can tighten it up, it brings value and the challenges of brevity. Brevity forces us to cut excess, get rid of the waffle. So being accurate, clear, and concise can be difficult. Next slide, please. What is the title? The title is what readers see first. And this one has stuck in my memory for many years because it was a brilliant title. It was All That Wheezes Is Not Asthma. It relates to ENT, of course. I mean, the amount of times we've respiratory have admitted someone with asthma that turns out to be a laryngeal stridor. Punchy as possible and avoid cramming. Don't stick it, but just get it nice and smooth. I mean, you're going to read that. That is a title that reads well. Next slide, please. So the title, get the title right. Abstract. Believe it or not, the abstract of your paper is probably the only part that's ever read. It's on PubMed, therefore a lot of authors will only read the abstract. And they may well make clinical decisions based on your abstract. The abstract, if it's good and tight and accurate, it will influence the editor. Never rush. It's probably the hardest one to write is the abstract, just to get your word limit and get the points in that you wish. And you wish to get them. A proper abstract is a true summary of your paper. But never rush it and never skimp it. And probably leave it to the end, because it is, as I said, the part that people will see when they click it up on PubMed. Next slide, please. I'm repeating myself, but what we're saying here is what are the characteristics of good abstract? And this counts for presentation as well. And I mean, if you're submitting for a prize presentation, it's the abstract that gets you, that sells the study to the reviewers, and it gets you in. So, but of course, tell the truth, but get it right. So you look for the instruction. What's the instruction for the abstract? Is the research original? Is it relevant? Is it good quality? Is there clarity in scholarship? Is the title clear and understandable? And is the introduction brief and pertinent and related to the 3 questions I outlaid at the start, and I will repeat again later. Next slide, please. Back to where we were. The 3 questions on the introduction. And again, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about it? And how are you going to talk about it? And that is your introduction. Build as much as you like around it, but a lot of what people write in the introduction should actually be reserved for the discussion. And because you've done the study, and because you've got the results, and because you've got the methods, and because you might have a conclusion, the discussion is the hardest part to write. That's what's going to put your mental block. That's what's going to say, right, God, where do I go here? How do I write a discussion? Because very often when you get to writing a paper, you've presented the study already. And you have the skeleton of the study except for the discussion. Yes, you have a conclusion, but the meat of the paper is in the discussion. Next slide, please. So, which brings me to the discussion. Blank page, where do we start? Okay, well, the first thing you think is, okay, can I have a general statement on the study? By now, you know your study better than anybody else, but can we have a general statement? Then, what is can we give a brief summary of the results? So what were the important results from your study? Then you need to interpret the results and discuss the content in the same sequence. So you have a sequence in the aim, you have a sequence in the methods, you have a sequence in the results, and now you want to talk about what those results imply. So say what your findings imply, not what you would like them to imply, not what they ought to imply, but what they imply. What do your findings mean? And if you have a novelty, if there is something new, point it out, and point it out there in the discussion. Because all you've done so far is you've tabulated the results. Now you're talking about them. Next slide, please. Compare and contrast. So what you've done already is you've looked at the publications that are out there. You've looked at where do the papers agree. In the introduction, you'll be looking at that. But how do your results compare and contrast to the papers already out there? And a simple way to do that is just have the papers note what they're saying, note what they're saying that agrees with you, and note what they're saying that doesn't agree with you, and try to explain why there's a difference. So there's a comparison of previous literature. And then you which leads into a critical appraisal of what you found and how it differs and why it differs to previous findings. Someone else has nearly always done something. That doesn't make your paper worthless. There's always something in your paper that adds to the study that's been done before. And then you say to yourself, well, here are the similarities, here are the differences, and if they're different, again, speculate as to why. So this is the skeleton for discussion. Next slide, please. What else should be in there? Well, problems that were encountered in data collection. I'm sorry if there's a background noise there. What are the suggestions for corrections into the future? What are the suggestions for maybe improving the study or a study, or for someone else to do it into the future? Your conclusion will depend on your findings and, of course, depend on the journal. And at the end of the day, any paper is, how does this work influence clinical practice? Have you introduced anything that might change our everyday work? And hopefully you have. But, point it out. Just say, well, this, if it's a scientific work, you're saying, well, where can this lead into change in clinical practice? If it's a retrospect, if it's a review of a clinical series, how does your work change? How does it work change the practice or what we've been doing up until now? I've done a few papers myself in the past where I've listened to a mantra from a boss, a trainer, and I've said, oh, well, I think there might be something different there. And you go off and you check it, and yes, and sure enough, it proves that you've looked at it and you've said, no, hang on, that mantra is wrong. So that's the best answer, of course, that you're changing clinical practice. Next slide, please. You have the paragraphs, you've the discussion, you've got your paragraphs laid out. You've maybe 5 or 6 paragraphs in your discussion, and you say to yourself, now, okay, are they logical? Do they follow? If they don't, you can cut and paste your paragraphs, but make sure that there's a progression, a natural progression. Avoid ending with a whimper. You've done a study. Don't give up at the last minute. Make sure you score that goal. You've got into the box. Score it. Avoid further work. Avoid the term further work is necessary to answer questions posed. No, you've asked the questions. Can you answer them? Because if you can't, you can't. Avoid preliminary findings will need to be discussed. You're looking at what you've done, not at what can be done into the future. But you can suggest it, and you can say there's a gap here and there's a gap there, and we need to address those gaps into the future. But you tie it up. Your discussion is about what you have found, what you've done and what you've found, not what you'd like to do and like to find. Next slide, please. If I divide the discussion now, in summary, back into 5 questions. Number 1, general statement and summary of results. Number 2, what do your results imply? Number 3, how do they compare and contrast with literature? Number 4, what are the strengths and weaknesses of your study? And number 5, have you identified gaps, and does your study prompt further research? And that's 5 paragraphs, and that's your discussion. So therefore, that's the scaffold of the 5 Qs in discussion added to the Magnificent 7 I mentioned earlier. And so you've got a blank page. You write down those 5 points and you fill based on what you found. And I think that's going to give you the basis of your discussion. And as I said earlier, the meat of your paper. Next slide, please. Go back one again. There we are. An article that is cited. So to cite means, that someone has felt that that they're quoting you because they like what you've said or they agree with what you've said. Rarely it's the opposite. But for an article to be cited, it has to be published. And to be published, it must be written. And if it's written, it has to satisfy a peer review process, which is in itself an achievement. Not so long ago, 70% of all published articles are never cited, and 89% of them are referenced are cited less than 10 times. And that's a study I did from Liverpool over 20 years ago. And basically what we looked at was a century of citation classics, which we looked at the papers that had been cited more than 100 times, and there weren't many. Next slide, please. Back one. Yeah. Again, I'm boasting a little bit, but another study from in collaboration with my good friend Professor Coelho in Richmond, Virginia. He repeated the citation classics I think it was 20 years later, and found that, that there was a huge rise because in the quantity and the nature, because primarily of increased publications, better information technology, better communication, advancements in all stages. And these all allowed studies and experiments to be performed and written, reviewed and published and cited at higher rates in a much faster than what I was exposed to and my peers at the same level of development would have done when we were checking for what was written and what was not written, because I promise you it was hard work back in the mid-90s as against now. Next slide, please. One of my first papers in what I call my esoteric academics, and this is a lot of the papers that I'm quoting to you here now, was in Clinoto in February 2000. And what we looked at was the citation error and the quotation error of articles in otolaryngology head and neck journals. And it was astounding. We found that the citation error rate in papers was 37.5%. And of those, 11.9% were major errors of citation, giving the wrong journal, giving the wrong authors. I mean, you're speaking of quite significant citation errors. Which was even more important was the 17% quotation error and 11.1% major errors. So a paper was quoting another paper and the quote was incorrect. And 11% of them were serious. And in fact, almost the opposite to what was being said in the original. And that was our paper in 2000. We repeated the test. We repeated the study again with Professor Coelho in 2018. So we move on to the next slide. So remember, 37 and 11. And this showed that errors were still prevalent, but they were 50% better. The reduction was 50%. So they'd halved, but they were still there. And there was still citation error and still quotation error. So when you're quoting a paper, when you're citing a paper, make sure you get it right. It has huge implications, not least on patient care, because you may make a decision based on an error, and therefore your patient's in trouble or could be in trouble. We do feel that the responsibility lies with the authors, but it also lies with the reviewers and it lies with the editors, because everyone can make a mistake, but all three must work to further reduce error rates and maintain the integrity of publications. And it's sticking to the detail. It's making sure that if you're quoting a foreign language, that you get the translation correct. That if you are quoting a paper, you get the reference right. Now, there are reference manager and all forms of other aspects out there now to help, but these didn't exist back in 2000, but they certainly existed in 2018, and errors are still occurring. Next slide, please. One of my favorites, a case report. Some of you out there may never have published a paper. And the easiest paper of all and the first paper to publish is a case report. Nothing wrong with a case report. It can bring in new or rare disease or a complication, a new diagnostic technique or technology. It can be an uncommon histology in an uncommon site, and it's very useful. And the bottom line about it, in my opinion, in a case report is the so what factor. If you've got a case report and you've a learning process from that case report, the way to look on it is, so what? Does that teach you something, and do you want to spread the word that it has taught you something? Have you learned something from it? And the answer is, so what? If it passes the so what factor, it's worthy of submission and writing, of writing and submission, and of course, publication. So think of the so what factor in the case report. Next slide, please. I'm a fan of the case report, and there are many journals who've dropped case reports, but should it be eliminated? Well, I mean, the basis of all teaching is the bedside clinical practice, or the outpatients, and each patient we see and each patient we learn from is a case report. So therefore, no, I think we need to save the case report, and I've published several papers on the case report, on saving the case report, refining it to improve it. But it is a forum for exchange of information, and it's an opportunity for you to participate in medical writing. It's the easiest one to write, or to start off writing, and it's probably, we all started most likely with a case report published in the journals that still publish case reports. Next slide, please. Oris Narsis in 2004, we said tackling the case report, and our summary from that was that resuscitative measures are required to make sure it survives. It needs a more applicable summary, and there should be a limit on authors. There shouldn't be a village writing a case report, pages and references. And very often journals are trying to save money by saving space, and therefore they don't want to publish case reports. But case reports in themselves are very important. Again, I'm pushing it because if you haven't written before, you're going to write a case report. We did another study where we looked at the rare adverse events in ENT. And yeah, it was important. And we did identify it as very important, because if we've got a rare case report and then a rare adverse event, these events will not end up in a series of art, in a case series. The only way you'll know about them is in the case report. And we've all met adverse events that we never heard of before, or that are pretty unusual. And therefore, I'm using this presentation to say, yeah, don't give up on the case report. And it is important. Next slide, please. If we have stricter guidelines, another paper of ours just to say that stricter guidelines and a shorter, more focused article, which should help to preserve it, which brings me back to what I said to you earlier. I'm sorry for the length of this paper, but I didn't have time to write a short one. You can get a case report and what the case report conveys out in a brief article. The only problem is it's going to be harder to write just what's important. The important positives and the important negatives. Show the scan, show the report, show what happened, end of story, case report, published. Next slide, please. We repeated it all in the citation rates, and we do say it's not worthy of its tarnished record. It is declining in publication in journals, and maybe it has a limited future. Although in more recent years, there are now online journals out there that are publishing case reports specifically, and it may well be the answer. Of course, some of them you've got to pay. I am not a believer in paying for a publication that you've written in the medical literature, and I've refused to be a member of any editorial board where people are charged. I think you've put enough work into it. You've done it on your time off, and I do not believe that you should have to pay to publish a paper that's worthy of publishing and a clinical message that most of them do convey. Next slide, please. Yep, I've written a paper on the role of the letter to the editor. We published that again from our unit in 2015 European Archives. What's interesting is that it does have a critical function. Of the papers, of the ENT journals we looked at, 49% were agreeing with the paper they were quoting, and 32% were disagreeing. Others were either clarifying or ignoring and just wished to get a message in. It is a very easy way to get a publication. It serves two main purposes. It's a post-publication peer review, and you're also and in some journals will allow it, where you're sharing experiences with fellow readers, of your experiences. It's important. We concluded that we need to maintain the journal's high standards, and indexing needs to be improved in letters. Next slide, please. I've already mentioned our postal online surveys. We introduced a 30-point quality measure, and we used that to apply. We applied that to the questionnaires, and the average study was 32%. So they were pretty poor. Again, I don't want you to quote. You don't need to quote my paper, or our papers. We did two, as I said. One was a follow-up. But it just gives you and this was based on a statistician and an expert on postal questionnaires, where we introduced what we felt, what she felt should be included in all postal questionnaires. So it is a handy way of producing a questionnaire, because they do have their place. They are easy to do, but you need to set them up correctly in the first instance. Next slide, please. So the follow-up paper, which was some years afterwards, did show the quality had improved. I did mention the ethics earlier. I won't mention it again. I just did. But recurring methodological flaws still exist. And we said, if we apply what should be done, we include it, and what methods should be included in a questionnaire, we are going to improve the validity of findings, and as a consequence, the impact on clinical practice. I was saying myself, I mean, I've published postal questionnaires long before these studies. We did one on Globus from Liverpool with Chris Webb many years ago. It's still being quoted left, right, and centre. And but I think that if you are going to do one, and there's nothing wrong with doing them, because it does give us information, make sure you've got ethics, make sure you've got that it's structured well, because then if it is, it's easy to write, it's easy to get it published. Next slide, please. I have published again on the citation rates, and we looked at citation rates in rhinology, and we looked at the journal Rhinology, and we said, how does is it a measure of quality or utility? And in essence, as an individual measure, it reflects utility rather than quality. I think the point I'm making is that you can write about anything, and you can write about almost anything, but as long as you write it well, as long as you write it ethically, as long as you make it interesting, as long as there's a reason at the end of the day for writing it, I think it will get published. Next slide, please. So finally, and I timed this for 45 minutes, and for the first time in a long time, I'm actually not far off. But finally, don't get excited. You've written the paper. Hasten slowly, all right? Or hurry slowly, because put it down, put it away, read it again, and you'll say to yourself, Jesus, did I really write that? Or you'll just see stuff. Read it again. Get a friend. I mean, maybe not a friend who's demanding to be an author, but get someone who's not in the game, and just ask them to read it purely from a grammatical point of view, from a spelling point of view, and just as an overall easy read. Check your instructions. Check the instructions to authors. They nearly always ask for a cover letter. So if they ask for a cover letter, that's just as important, because they're saying, why are you submitting this letter, this publication to this journal? And you bring out the importance of why and why you think it is. Next slide, please. Revision. So you've sent it in, and a revision is often required, as I said. It's intended to be helpful, because if they haven't rejected it, they see a probability that they'd like to publish the paper, but they want you to publish it and write it a little bit better. It is intended to improve the paper. Don't be sensitive. If there's a disagreement between you and the reviewer, point it out to the editor and explain politely, because you don't want to get in the face of the reviewer or the editor. And then, of course, you're rejected. Don't bleed. Don't bleed. I mean, they're going to write, it adds little to current knowledge. It's not supported by data presented. The writing is verbose and confused. They'll say it. They'll cut to the chase. They won't hold back. They'll tell you why you're rejected. So what do you do? Next slide, please. Well, actually, sorry. I found this very interesting 3-stage reaction to bad news or truth. Schopenhauer is the guy who's accredited. And I've seen this. I've seen this myself. I've seen it with colleagues. I've seen it with my senior authors when I was a junior. And first of all, ridiculous. How could anyone fail to accept my work? Second reaction. So it's like the 5 stages or the 6 stages of death, of acceptance. So 2, you're violently opposed. I'm going to write to the chief editor. Now that's usually the senior author. This is disgraceful. How dare they? And then of course the third one is, it's accepted because you've read again and you've read what they're saying and they're probably right. And therefore it's self-evident. What do? You rewrite. Next slide, please. Why are papers rejected? Back to what I said to you earlier, poor construction of paper. You didn't follow the rules. You didn't do it in a logical fashion. Your English was poor. There was careless preparation of the manuscript, poor grammar, poor English, flawed experimental design, lack of originality, and the one we all hate is would not advance knowledge, because you've written that paper and you believe that you have advanced knowledge, and it's a bit of a kick in the you-know-whats to be told that it doesn't advance knowledge. Next slide, please. BMJ in 1979 looked at 1,551 papers that were submitted to the BMJ. Of those, 1,223 were rejected. Of those, 836 were rewritten and accepted elsewhere. So what do? Well, the beauty of getting editor and reviewer comments is you can improve your paper automatically with a little help from them. So you consider their comments and you do it and you change it. And you say where you misunderstood. And if you're misunderstood, it's your fault, it's not their fault, that you weren't clear enough, you didn't clarify. So therefore you need to address what they're saying is wrong. So you recast, rewrite, and send it somewhere else. There's nothing wrong with it. You can do that because they were kind enough, they were rude enough to reject you. They were kind enough to tell you why you rejected, address what they're doing, and send it somewhere else, because it may not have been a paper suitable for BMJ or whatever journal you've submitted to. Next slide, please. The publish or perish. I was told myself, I was heading to Australia and I was told if I didn't publish, I would perish. I would never get back. And at the time, we were not in the continuum. You're lucky enough to be in the continuum. We did junior reg, had to work 4 years and then actually compete for senior reg. So the senior reg, the average publications to get accepted on British or Irish senior reg training programs at the time was you had to have a minimum of 8 publications. Now those publications are back down now to possibly, I don't know, I mean, where are the medical students now? Because I'm seeing a lot more medical students presenting and publishing. So publish or perish, it's wrong. You know, some people aren't just made to write, but it is there for promotion or funding from a university or department. There is increased pressure. You're supposed to publish as frequently as possible. Many of them could be trivial studies. Some of those salami slice, I'll come into that now in a second. If you submit one paper to 2 different journals, that's wrong, that's duplication. And there maybe are marginal authors, as I said earlier, on the gift authorship. Next slide, please. How do we do it? Well, put a ceiling on how many papers a junior doc or a junior consultant might need to present or publish. Better training, more attention. Just, take the pressure off. Just say, look, when I arrived in Australia, my boss said to me, Paul Fagan, he said, he's still alive, thank God. He said, he was skull based in Sydney. He said, John, you're here for a year. 1 case report and 1 paper would be perfect. That's all I ask. When I left Sydney, I had 20 plus. And he says that I doubled his CV. So yeah, that was a good year in Australia at that time. Next slide, please. Fraud and misconduct. I'm going to just mention piracy, plagiarism. There are methods out there now to if you plagiarize, if you copy word for word from a paragraph, they'll find it. The tools are there, and most journals now will run a plagiarism test or assessment prior to acceptance. Fraud, deliberate deception, usually invention, very rare, but it does happen. And I don't think it's happened in ENT, but it's certainly in anesthetics. We've had it. We've just submitted a paper with Professor Coelho on retraction, not sorry about this, not attic retraction, but retraction of journals. of papers in journals. We'll hopefully get it published in the near future. Next slide, please. What is duplication? Duplication is where you're submitting two very similar studies. Salami is where you're slicing up a big study, say from a MD or MCH, and you're using it. You're supposed to get 8 papers out of a proper MCH degree. That was the old-fashioned way. But don't try to parcel it out that suddenly you're seeming to try to get 8 papers out of a study that should only have 2 or 4. Next slide, please. So salami slicing. Again, yep, I did a letter to Laryngoscope on that because they did a paper and they showed that it hadn't changed significantly over 10 years. This is a paper by Chung. And what they said was, that they were talking about self-plagiarism. They were talking about higher degree projects. But what they didn't do was what we did in our letter. We sent in that we're not disagreeing with what you're saying, but if an author is not sure if this is salami slicing and you've already published a similar paper, then you tell the journal editor that you have a similar paper published. You don't think it's salami slicing. You think it's standalone and worthy, and let the editor make the decision. You don't make the decision. And that takes all of any accusation of fraud away from you. You tell the author or tell the editor, we've already published a paper similar. And that's the answer. Next slide, please. So it is a gray area. The decision is ultimately with the journal editor. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned this already, how many authors should you include? And disputes are becoming more frequent, but number one, the bottom line is, have they contributed to the creative process? Have they contributed to the idea or to the performance of the study? Have they helped in preparation of the manuscript? And most important of all, have they read and agree with the final paper? And those 3 last points are the 3 points of authorship. That satisfies most journals, those 3 points. Next slide, please. So, I thought it was nearly finished. There we go. Publication rate. I did a study in Liverpool with Andrew Jones of the publication rates of the ORS Society, and it was 69%. It was probably the highest of all of the various specialties. So it validates the selection process of the abstracts, but it was higher than most meetings. So kudos and hats off to the ORS for the very high publication rate. And 69%, I promise you, is high. Next slide, please. I looked at my own Sylvester O'Halloran meeting, which I've been running for maybe 20 years, and I want to thank Abraham for supporting it recently with some great papers. And in fact, one of his team won a double, won the best oral and the best poster presentation. That's the only time that's ever happened. I did a review of the entire meeting over a 17-year period and published it recently. But the publication rate was 27%, which is pretty low compared to the 69% I've just quoted. Features that I think are important to let you know is that some papers, 10% of papers were published over 5 years from presentation. A female author was 3 times more likely to publish a paper than a male. You should publish your work as soon as possible because others may get the same idea, either from the meeting abstracts or have come up with the same idea separately, as 40% of papers were usurped in that someone else published similar papers in 40% of cases. Next slide, please. Summary, stick to the rules. The more you practice, the better you get. It takes a lot longer than you think. An ethical publication will depend on the ethical investigator. Next slide, please. So we think of an idea, that's impressive. We pursue the study, that's optimistic. We complete the study, that's admirable. We present the study, that's applaudable. We publish the article, that's an achievement. When you start, you want to finish. And the start is the idea and the end is to publish. And a lot of people don't publish. So to finish off, I'll reiterate the questions. What are you talking about? Why are you talking about it? What are you going to do about it? What did you do? How did you do it? What did you find? Next slide. What do the results mean? What else has been published? What do they say? How does the data compare to your work? What is new? How does it enhance clinical practice? Because at the end of the day, that's what the paper is about. Next slide, please. So conclusion must relate to the introduction and your findings. You should try writing. And if you write a bit more, you might even get to enjoy it. And I must admit, I am a sad you-know-what, because I did get to enjoy it. But at first, it was a chore. Take-home message, 3 points. Be ethical, be entertaining, and be enduring. And by that I mean, give a message that the reader will remember, and they will remember, and they will learn from it and help the patients. Thank you.
This is amazing. I've listened to this presentation before, but still, still enjoying it, to be honest. It's like refreshing when an idea comes to my brain. How am I gonna write it down? So if you don't have like a track and questions to answer, for sure you will not reach to a proper paper to be published. You have to get the answer to every questions before starting to write your ideas as well. So thank you, Prof. It was amazing, to be honest. And just again, just a reminder to all of the attendees, please write your emails in the chat if you are interested to get the CDB points certificate. And if anyone wants to ask any questions for Professor Fenton, just you can unmute yourself and ask the question by yourself.
I have a question to Professor Fenton. Hi, my name is Dr. Hossain. I'm one of the ENT doctors at Leicester Royal Infirmary. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It's to the point. To be honest, I've been reading other medical writing research books, and it's like you have squeezed all of the books in your presentation.
Thank you.
Just a question. So, a lot of time I'm talking to the other juniors or my colleagues. So they are using, they have new technology, GPT or whatever, for writing introduction and things. I said, oh, I have written the introduction. They say, oh, I've just put it on the ChatGPT and everything is there. So my question, you said, because your take-home message would be ethical. I was talking to my colleague, I said, I don't think so it's ethical. So he was like, there is no unethical in it. So what do you think about this?
It's a good question. And it's a question that I've asked people at conferences, and I haven't got an answer. It's why the round table, and it's why Ray Clark next year in Dublin is presenting on the ethics of GPT. In Bulgaria just last week before last, they accepted it. They said that it was allowed, but one doctor who presented this paper, I went to the meeting, I went to his talk because this was the title of his talk, and he said that it was okay to do it, but that it made mistakes. That mistakes were made in the article writing by ChatGPT or whichever one you're using. At the same meeting, Ray Clark says to me that some ghostwriters in the States are writing the papers for the juniors. The ethics isn't there. This has just exploded in our faces over the last maybe couple of years. So there are no ethical, how will I say it, guidelines. I don't think it's ethical to pretend you've written something if it's been written by a robot. I don't think it's ethical to pretend you've written something if it was written by a team of writers employed by your hospital. But it's up to the editors of the journals to decide what's ethical and what isn't. So it's not for me, but if you're using the robot or the AI to produce a paper and then you're correcting it yourself and submitting and putting in your own and inserting your own thoughts on it, then it probably at the moment is not unethical, but it just doesn't feel right. But that discussion is out there. And as I said, the chair of the meeting in Sofia said he saw no problem. He thought that it would improve the papers that were being sent in. I just don't feel it's right. But again, that's my opinion, and I can't give you a better answer than that. I think that over the next year or two, it will, I suppose, crystallize, and we'll have a better idea.
Okay, thank you so much.
And thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
You're on mute there, Ibrahim.
Sorry, anyone else want to ask question? Just we are running in time, so thank you, Prof, for the nice presentation. Everyone is really seem to be enjoying it in the comments. A lot of thanks for you. So I'll say that's the end of the session, and thank you everyone for attendance. We are announcing our laser course hands-on for carbon dioxide diode, sorry, not the blue laser and the KTP laser on the 6th of September, and this will be advertised and sent to the emails as well. If anyone interested, it's not going to be virtual, it will be hands-on on the place, and it's a free course, but it's the priority is mainly for the trainees. And again, this is the end of the session. Thank you. Thanks, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you for your invite. Thanks for listening.